Okay, so welcome everybody. I'm Andy Miller. I organized the department seminar series, and we're very excited about our guest speaker here today. And I'm just going to tell you briefly what's coming up. So you see today's seminar at the top of that list. Next week we have a virtual seminar with Dr. Jamon Vandenhoek from Geography Department at Oregon State, and he's going to be talking about conflict ecology, remote sensing of environmental change in relation to processes of conflict, displacement, and resilience. So interesting combination of remote sensing and social science, and has some overlap with the one we had with Sumalika Biswas last week, although it wasn't specifically conflict ecology. And then the following week, our own Dr. Chris Swan will be talking, and that will be over in the biology department, Biology 004. The following week, our seminar time will be with our guest star, two research faculty who will be doing a poster session and lightning talks in the basement. And then later that afternoon, there is a talk that's actually sponsored by Human Context and Science Sector Technology, and it's part of the Social Sciences Forum, and that'll be at 4 o'clock in the library gallery. We're co-sponsoring it. So that one's called White Supremacy, Animal Advocacy, and the Longue Durée of Misanthropy. So I am eager to find out exactly what that title means, particularly the last part of it. And then the last one for this semester is, again, virtual, Dr. Anastasia Romanou from the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies. And that's going to be about the growing frequency, intensity, and magnitude of marine heat waves. For those of you who may not have been following the news, marine heat waves are a very big thing. This is a real crisis in terms of what's happening in our oceans. So without any further ado, I'm going to take that off the screen. I'm going to invite Kira to read the introduction, and then Amanda will take it over.
All right, Dr. Amanda Phillips de Lucas is the director of the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance. Prior to this role, she was a postdoctoral fellow with the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies. There, she studied perceptions and governance of urban greening projects in Baltimore and cities across the United States. While at Carey Institute, she developed Governing Green, a toolkit to enhance the equitable governance of urban green infrastructure. In 2018, Amanda received her PhD in Science and Technology Studies from Virginia Tech. She also has degrees from Virginia Tech, NYU Gallatin, and Bennington College. Her dissertation examined how activists and community groups in Baltimore used technical data to protest urban interstate construction in the late 1960s and 1970s. This research was published as a chapter in Justice and the Interstate, The Racist Truth About Urban Highways, co-edited by Dr. Phillips de Lucas. She serves on the advisory committee for the Baltimore City Recreation and Parks Playbook and the working group for Washington, D.C.'s Department of Energy and the Environmental Justice and Equity Assessment Tool.
Thank you, everyone. And can we hear me? I'm loud, but I want to make sure we're good. All right, excellent. So I actually have the book. And I'm just going to, you can pass it around. You can feel it. You can say you touched it once upon a time. It feels good. So first, I want to thank you all for having me today. I am so thrilled to be here. I'm so thrilled that so many of you came. And I'm excited to talk a little bit about this book. As was sort of mentioned, I am the director of the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance. I think some of you know my colleague, Cheryl Knott, who teaches here. Oh, I have to step into the screen so it can actually see me. And I started the job at BNIA like a week after the book came out. And because I started a week after the book came out, I actually haven't had a lot of opportunities to talk about it. I did like a few Q&As and stuff, but this is, I think, kind of the first official book talk that I've given. So I'm really excited about it and thrilled to be able to share it in a local context. So I have a bit of an outline about this, and I was wondering if I could get just like a show of hands. How many of you are graduate students in the room? Oh my gosh, almost all. And then undergraduate students. All right, so a few of you, and then faculty, and then Miranda. Okay. So we got a really good mix of people in the audience. I'm going to start out by talking about how I wrote the book. I assumed that there was going to be a lot of graduate students in the room today, and I wanted to kind of give you a background on how that happened for me, because I know that that process can be opaque, especially when you're a graduate student or sort of figuring things out. And then I'm going to sort of do a brief history of urban interstates, both talking about the project a little bit and then combining some of my research. And then I'll do a bit of a deeper dive into my chapter, particularly in the book, which is about Baltimore. If you have questions, feel free to interrupt me. I know we'll do a formal Q&A, but if there are clarifying things, like, I do not mind. Throw your hand up, ask me a question. It's always good to have that dialogue there. Okay, so Justice in the Interstates came out in January, February 2023. And I think that how this book got written is really interesting, and it's not a typical publishing journey. So I was on Twitter way back in 2021, before it was X, while it was still functional Twitter. And I saw a tweet from the Urban History Association's blog called The Metropole. And The Metropole is a really great blog, and I think sort of a fantastic, just regular reading. But they posted that they were going to be doing a series on justice and the interstates. I had written a whole dissertation on urban highway building in Baltimore, so I immediately emailed the editor and I was like, put me in. I'm ready. And he's just like, all right, well, the series is already together. It's been together for about a month, but if you can get me something in like a week and a half, maybe we'll put it out. So I was like, game on. And I quickly wrote up this blog post called The Perils of Public Participation, which was sort of a synthesis of one of the chapters of my dissertation. The whole series got a lot of attention very, very quickly. We were sort of picked up and featured in Next City and sort of pushed out into different places. And we ended up doing a lot of press and podcast interviews after that, one of which was very bizarre. I'll tell that story later if anyone wants to hear it. But I was just kind of like, well, I'm doing this ride. Like, I put this piece of writing out into the world. People seem really interested in it. I want to comment on it. I'm just going to kind of take what opportunities come up. This was also kind of this 2021 mid-pandemic, didn't have a ton of things going on at this point in time. So I was really excited about it. And then one of the opportunities that came out of this was we got contacted by one of the senior editors at Island Press. And Island Press said, we're really interested in turning this series into a book. Is there any of the contributors who would be interested in doing that? And I was one of the people who raised my hand, and Ryan Reft, who is the head editor at the Metropole, was one who raised his hand, and Becky Retzlaff, who's at Birmingham, was also one who raised their hand. And so that's kind of how we ended up signing a book contract. Now, that's not like I think a typical story for academic publishing, and this is not an academic press in any way. Island Press is a nonprofit press. They typically sort of make books that speak to practitioners or sort of very diverse audiences, and they were very clear with us when we were putting our book together. This is not a book. This is not a history. Well, it's a book, but it's not a history book, right? So we decided to both work with the authors who had contributed to the Metropole blog post to expand some of their entries. And we also recruited heavily for additional perspectives. And one of the places that we built out the end of the book was really from the community and advocacy perspective. So people specifically who are working on the ground to either take down urban interstates in their communities, or who had worked in a capacity that was less kind of engineering focused or less planning focused. So there were like a few main stages. One was recruitment. We had some who we recruited who kind of fell out, which is also, I think, a process of an edited book. There was the editing portion of the book, which I think took a lot more time than any of us were really anticipating. We kind of went into this and thought, oh, this will be easy. We'll take the blog post and then they'll come together. But that sort of second round, that expansion, it required a lot more sort of hands-on editing than we anticipated. And then the sort of copy editing and proofing stage of it all. We were also very lucky. We had an editor from Island Press. We were really well supported on the book. I know that a lot of academic publishers don't. You either have to hire a copywriter or hire people to sort of do some of that work. And we were very well supported by the press in that work. So I give all this context to say that a lot of this was kismet and luck, which I always hated when people would come and give like academic stories at presentations, be like, well, just kind of luck. But if there was one sort of takeaway for graduate students who are thinking about publishing or thinking about sort of trying out some of their work, I think that like the Metropole is a really good place to do it. And I think that there are other sort of blogs or semi-online journal that are like publication venues that are attached to journals that are a really good place to kind of push your work out there. And you never kind of know what's going to capture the zeitgeist at any particular time. I've put pieces out into the world that like I thought were really brilliant and great, and no one has ever spoken to me about them ever again since I put it out into the world. And while I really like the piece that turned into the chapter for this, it wasn't what I anticipated would sort of capture the moment. And these kind of online spaces are really low stakes ways to work with editors, often those who are maybe working on academic publishing or have in the past, who can work with you on your work, who can sort of help you clarify goals. And it's normally a very supportive process. And so I'd really advocate if you're sort of looking for ways to feature your writing, this might be a path for you. I have no guarantees as to whether it will lead to a book, but I do think it is a really great path for sort of working on your writing and circulating it with a wider audience. So that's kind of the introduction. Here are some of the articles that were featured in that original series on the Metropole. And the first one was by Sarah Jo Peterson, who she's a planner, but has worked in the highway space for a long time and now sort of operates as a consultant. And this sort of article, The Myth and Truth About Interstate Highways, is I think very much oriented towards the planning audience. And I think that that's important because there is a very large myth, I think, that we hear when we talk about urban interstate plannings, that the sort of the guts of the interstate system, the sort of cross-nation highways, those were really intentional. They got built up really quickly. And urban interstates were kind of a mistake. We didn't really know what was going on, like, whoopsies, urban interstates. And what she does in this kind of history that really sets the tone for the book, which is to say, nah, planners have been trying to build interstate highways since like the 1940s in US cities. They had plans on the books for these things, and more specifically, they were deliberately trying to put highways in where a majority Black or majority minority populations lived in order to displace those residents. There's intentionality there. There is no whoops highways. It was intentionally built to dispossess families of their homes, of their businesses, particularly in cities. And that was really the theme that we sort of brought into the book was what are these kind of myths that we think about when we think about the history of highway planning? And then more broadly, what are we doing about it at this moment in time? So this is one of my favorite highway images. Does anyone know where it's from? Can anyone take any guesses?
In LA?
No, but I can definitely see why you would think LA. It looks like LA. Any other thoughts?
It looks like a model.
Yeah, it is a model. So good. All right. So has anyone heard of the Futurama exhibit at the 1939 World Fair? Yeah. So Norman Bell Geddes comes in 1939 World's Fair in Queens, and he puts up this Futurama exhibit. Now, what happened at the Futurama exhibit? Well, you rode on like a little car. If you've ever been on the Haunted Mansion at Disney World, it's like one of those forward-facing cars, and you rode through this scenery of a highway. It started kind of rural, and you were really big, and the highway was really small. You were overlooking a model. And then as you move through the exhibit, the highway gets bigger and it gets bigger. And when you get off the ride, you exit into this. You exit into the highway and the urban highway of tomorrow. So like you would kind of step along this thing and overlook. You were actually in it. You could see how cities were being transformed by growing automobility, by highways. This was a very powerful cultural moment. Thousands upon thousands of people visited this exhibit every single day while it was open. And they weren't driving. They were taking the train from Queens. And this isn't familiar with New York. You had to get to Queens, and that's always a bit of a trip. So this was really exciting. This really kind of caught up the cultural zeitgeist of, oh my gosh, cities are going to be this place where automobility and roads coexist. And realistically, this is a road coexisting with a city, right? You've got a lot of vehicles, but you're overlooking them. You still have pedestrian routes, but it looks a lot different than what we have today. Anyway, and I always like to sort of preface this to say that, like, we know how destructive highways were and are, but there was a moment in our history where planners and engineers were trying to envision possibilities where the road and people coexisted somewhat differently. And we had a very powerful vision for that within the Futurama exhibit. So backing up a little bit more, this is one of the urban highway plans that we had for Baltimore. This was what was called the 3A plan. So just as sort of to point out, this is the center of the city right here, and that sort of segment G where it says under construction, that's US 40, that's the highway to nowhere. There were a lot of different plans. The 3A plan is kind of what people refer to when they talk about the highway plans, but this is what was envisioned to kind of happen. But even still, you can see there's a little bit of like that east connection of 83 where it comes down. We never got that, but that's kind of what was anticipated. And I think this plan's from 1974, so kind of later stages of the highway. But this is what we got. And for those who are not familiar, this is US 40, sometimes called the highway to nowhere. It is a 1.32 mile stretch of highway that bisects Harlem Park and Franklin Square in Baltimore. If you've driven it before, you will know that it connects on either side to just local roads. And it is probably, I think, one of our nation's best examples, unfortunately, of exclusionary infrastructure. It divides a neighborhood in half. It serves very little purpose. And it's kind of just there. So the question that I had when I was doing research and then working on the book is, how did we get to this roadway? How did we only build 1.32 miles? And you might say, Amanda, we also built 83. Yes, I know we built 83, but we didn't have to take down as many homes to build 83 because it runs along our river, which we know is another problem altogether, but we're not going to talk about 83 today. We're going to talk about this little road. And this is a quote from one of the activists who we're going to get into their story later, which is, we have been asked to make sacrifice after sacrifice in the name of progress. And when that progress has been achieved, we find it marked whites only. So how do we get here? So 1944-ish, wartime. City of Baltimore is trying to figure out if they can build an arterial route, so a route straight through the city, or whether they should build a harbor bridge. And there was a lot of debate in Baltimore about which route should be built. Shipping interests were against the harbor bridge because they were worried about boat sizes. The arterial route was going to require a lot of residential displacement. And at the time, there really wasn't enough money for both routes. So big debate going on at City Council about which they should bring. So City Council does what City Council in Baltimore does and continues to do, is they brought in a consultant from New York to help solve the problem. Does anyone know who that consultant from New York was in 1944? Yeah. Oh, we can't talk about urban infrastructure without talking about Robert Moses. So this is some of the early conceptualizations of this sort of midway sort of arterial route into the city. And Moses comes in with all of his bluster and puts out a report that's called the Baltimore Arterial Report. And really, he was hired to choose, do we want that harbor bridge or do we want that artery? And Moses comes in and really unsurprisingly, given what we know, goes for that artery, right? He's just like displace, displace, displace. And the language in this is shocking, even still shocking, but you know, I think we get that sort of 1940s air about what slum areas and blighted areas were, but this language is sort of repeated throughout the text over and over again, that, you know, the more slums are wiped out, the healthier Baltimore will be in the long run. This is a photo of an alley house from sort of the Franklin-Mulberry corridor at the time that was used in the imagery. And this is what Moses planned for that corridor. So that, not great. Yeah, it's, there are trees though, so I guess it would have increased the canopy. We have that. But even at the time, by the time the report got to City Council, Frank Brune, who was a council member at the time, or someone who was on the committee, was basically said that the plan, the 10D plan, poses a mountain of human misery. It would have displaced 19,000 residents in total, totally decimated the tax base of the city with that. And basically the council at the time just thought the human costs of these plans were far too great. But really the Baltimore Arterial Report just focuses on that artery area. It really is focusing about that development. There's some like broader conceptual network plans, but realistically, it put kind of like pre-condemnation orders on the Franklin-Mulberry corridor. City wouldn't invest in properties in there because they said, we're building the road there anyway. Banks wouldn't give loans. And it was already challenging for these businesses to get loans at that time, just due to the HLC mortgage rounds. I mean, this sort of long-term civic disinvestment started with the Baltimore Arterial Report, even though we didn't get a highway until the late 70s. So it's important to sort of realize that like planning has consequences, even if you're not like implementing plans. But that was sort of the pre-moment that sort of foreshadowed what we eventually got. Gotta go back. So this, moving forward about 20 years, well, a little less than that, 1956, we passed the Federal Aid Highway Act. And the Federal Aid Highway Act, huge windfall of money, and what sort of historians call the 90-10 money. It means that 90%, the federal government was going to pay 90% of the money to construct interstates, and municipalities only had to pay 10% of those costs. So huge incentives to build highways at this moment in time. It's that post-war boom. We're seeing sort of suburbanization trends start to happen. Real want for highway development. And almost immediately in Baltimore, the plans for urban interstate building are controversial. You might have heard that they're called freeway revolts sometimes. You might have heard about a group called MAD, which was an acronym for Movement Against Destruction. They were a group of Baltimore City residents who, they're a coalition of different groups across the city that were working to fight against the highway. So MAD is typically the group that you hear about, but there were more all over the city. Realistically, there were groups in Fells Point. There were groups, as Andy and I were talking about, that supported Leakin Park, which is a whole other presentation that I could give on another day. But today we're going to be talking about a group called RAM, or Relocation Action Movement. And Relocation Action Movement was actually all from West Baltimore. They are all from the Franklin-Mulberry corridor. And their story doesn't get talked about a lot in sort of conversations about Baltimore's urban highway fights. And I really do hope my work is some of a correction for that. From a historical point of view, I think when we talk about Baltimore's history of highway building, we get really caught up in that we didn't get a highway. Like for the most part, we didn't build a highway system. There's a sense that like we won. Political careers were jump started based on the advocacy that happened. I don't think we can look at the highway to nowhere and say that we won, right? Like we took down a lot of houses, we displaced a lot of people, we caused a lot of harm. There's no winning in this story. There's no victory here. But it's worth acknowledging that relocation action movement worked very, very hard to find a place for themselves in the city. And my chapter in the book is really about their history and sort of early attempts at doing participatory planning. And so why am I interested in participatory planning historically? Because we often see structures like this, which is to say, like, how are we going to engage people in the sort of process of technical creation? And this was the model that a group called the Urban Design Concept Team, who were brought into Baltimore specifically in response to a lot of the advocacy efforts that were going on. And they provoke this structure. I'm not going to dive into exactly what this says, but it's a structure where you sort of move along in a linear process. People contribute their government actions, but people kind of contribute and talk and contribute along the way. Now, this is one from a current project in Baltimore that's going on right now. Structurally, they look almost exactly the same. Projects move along in a linear fashion. There are stakeholder meetings, committee meetings, and they all, it kind of exists on 3 different pathways, but eventually that sort of public participation comes in to influence the project. But they look really, really structurally similar. And I think that a lot of what my work does, especially in this chapter, is to say, we haven't really moved the needle much from that 1960s, 1970s moment in terms of how we think about community participation. So as I mentioned earlier, there was a group called the Urban Design Concept Team that was hired by the city of Baltimore, basically because there was so much advocacy against highway building. And the thought was, is if you assembled this team, they were planners, they were engineers, they were also sociologists and architects. It was a really interdisciplinary team. And the goal, led by this person on Nathaniel Owings, was that we should build technologies and infrastructure that involves both human and environmental values. That like we can't just build highways that are just about efficiency, right? They need to incorporate other types of values. So the team worked with West Baltimore communities to try to understand what those values were, what they would want to see in their houses. And they had a field office. They actually had a field office in West Baltimore, right around the corridor, where where residents and other organizations were like, they were encouraged to come to the field station to look at plans, to sort of learn more about how engineers had put together their technical data, to sort of comment and sort of make suggestions to the plans that they went on. And I think the sort of bottom quote is, it's available for you to work with. Like that was really the impulse that sort of structured the engagement that this group had with the communities in West Baltimore. And RAM was not the only group who used the sort of expertise of the Urban Design Concept Team. Movement Against Destruction also went into these sort of group, into the offices. And it's important, I'm not focusing so much on the MAD side, but Movement Against Destruction was sort of marked as what we would sort of term as like lay expertise. If they would go to a public hearing, they would take the sort of figures that the engineers put into their design plans and tell the engineers that they were wrong. Like that was their approach. They wanted to slow down the deliberately slow down the process of highway approval by calling into question the calculations that were being used to implement the highway process. Relocation Action Movement took a really different approach. And that approach comes out because they knew that they were going to be displaced. There was no question in their mind that they were not going to be living in the Franklin-Mulberry corridor for much longer. These plans had been on the books for so long, they couldn't get loans. Really, what they wanted was just more compensation for their houses. In addition to that, they wanted Black contractors to be able to work on the roads. They wanted more public like bus accessibility on the highway, which is an aside. Interstates don't really have bus off and ons because you have sort of standards of when you can have exits or not, which is why you don't see buses on kind of interstate highways that much. And sort of the group really was like, well, in order to have public transportation access, we need to sort of shift these standards so that buses can get on and off. They were making really situated and place-based demands. And as the quote up on the screen says, so the city was paying money for displacement, but residents in the Franklin-Mulberry corridor, their houses were valued after that sort of systemic devaluation that took place between 1940 and onward. So if a homeowner paid like around $7,000 in 1949, they owed more on the mortgage in total, the city would only give them about $5,000. So they were like really in the hole with the money that they were getting for compensation. And again, because of home like lending practices at the time, they typically were paying more for replacement housing than their white counterparts. Some calculations put that around $3,000 more than their white counterparts at the time. So what was going on is they were trying to advocate for more money. And what you really see in the documents at that time was, please give us more money so that we can stay in the city, that you're not giving us enough money to stay in the city, which I think is an important lesson right now, where Baltimore is seeing population loss, and we don't always hear that voice from communities at this moment that I want to stay in the city. We had this moment and we chose to sort of turn our backs on it in total. And this is an example of one of those sort of traffic figures that, or sort of arguments that MAD put forward, that traffic figures do not represent any type of peak hour impact or are not correlated with the transit traffic. And so you can kind of see there's really sort of like key differences between the kind of advocacy that was going on. One is very technically oriented, and one is really, it's about home, it's about place, it's about sort of being able to keep and, stay in the spaces that they loved. And this is actually a design that came out of the urban design concept team for what West Baltimore residents wanted out of the highway to nowhere. So just so I can diagram what's going on a bit, this is approaching Baltimore City. You still have the highway, but it's buried, and you have a train or a light rail sort of underneath it. And then you have these mixed use spaces on top of it. You have ballparks, you have commercial development, you have little parks and businesses attached with it. This is not too far off than what we might have gotten from those Harbor Place designs that came out earlier this week. The sort of, really imaginative viewing of what the city could be if we actually invested in place. And so two kind of major takeaways, and I think the first one that I make in the book a lot is that we've done public participation a lot. We've done public participation a lot. It shapes our vision for what the future is. We don't have a ton of really good case studies of those things actually getting built. Maybe in Boston with the big dig, but even still. So I think it's important to keep in mind that the act of including people in the participatory planning process does not equal equity, does not equal justice. It is a step, but it is just one step. And you really need to be able to follow through to achieve the kind of structural and procedural changes that you're hoping for. Secondly, is that data kind of matters here. Those arguments against technical expertise were very effective at slowing down the project. They're effective at slowing down the project, not stopping it. What stopped it were lawsuits. And again, conversation for another time. But there's a strategy in using data that I think is very important when we think about public participation. When we are working with communities, they might have very particular data needs or wants or something that can be used the data to make a certain argument. I often think one of the things that we can do in sort of the social sciencey space that we exist in is to be able to tell people the different cases that data can make, right? Really calling attention to the contextual space in which data exists in. So if you're talking to engineers, you likely want to go with that technical side of things, right? If you're talking to planners, well, maybe more of the sort of housing focus is useful. But there's a real use, I think, when working with communities and in this participatory process to not just identify what data they need, but also what data will be useful in order to make their arguments. And so with that, and I think I'm at that, 35 minutes, which is what you gave me. Just to say that the book is there, the book is available. There is a code, a discount code if you do want it, but I can also just send you the chapter too, as well. But the code does work because I did test it. But with that,
does that show up if you just go online?
Yeah, if you go to Island Books specifically and put in Justice all caps, as of last week, it still worked. So that's my one plug for Justice on the Interstates. But with that, I'd love to take questions.
And we have a good amount of time, so we have to be out of the room at 12:50.
Okay.
So
Okay.
fire away.
Or clap. Yes.
I have kind of two questions.
Mhm.
First question was, when these plans for interstates are being drawn, I know Baltimore used to have pretty complex streetcar structures
Mhm.
that got wiped out as the automobiles started taking over American cities. And you talked about how citizens wanted public transit in the interstate. I didn't know if you have anything about the public transit, streetcars, how they all played in interstate planning. That's my first question. The second question is very, very different. One of the things that I've been noticing is that when there are plans drawn, it's very utopic. It's like a utopia, and then the reality is so different. So what is? I mean, there's so much disconnect between what we envision and what we are left with.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, who's responsible for that? Can we hold anybody liable for that disconnect?
To the first question, I don't know the streetcar history as well as some others might. Is Eli Poussin still teaching around here somewhere? If you know Eli, ask him about the streetcars. You will get an hour and a half of explanation that I cannot provide to you at this moment. What I can say is if we were looking at like an aerial view of the highway to nowhere, this is kind of like, oh, what are they called? It's like, it's a path that like people have walked on by foot, and it's connecting sort of Fulton Ave to the north and the south. And you do kind of see people commonly walking around that route. I don't have any pictures in my presentation, but I do have some that sort of show people walking. And that corridor, that sort of Fulton Ave corridor where I know that there was a streetcar, that was like Black Main Street in Baltimore. It was a very sort of rich and vibrant commercial corridor that was used. And there was a lot of, it was deliberate to cut off that artery. And so where that falls in the history of the streetcar and kind of urban mobility, I can't say, but we know that putting US 40 in was a deliberate attempt and did displace a very vibrant, a very rich, and very well established Black community in Baltimore. And one of the ways was sort of cutting off that commercial lifeline. I think another thing we see historically was that in the shift from streetcars to automobility, a greater degree of policing of human bodies that, well, it's kind of started with the streetcar, right? Because streetcars were really dangerous and people kept getting killed by streetcars because they didn't really know. They were like, oh my gosh, this thing can kill me. So there were a lot of like campaigns sort of starting at that moment for making streets for mobility, for like auto mobility, whether that be a streetcar, whether that be an actual car. And those transitions are like important to kind of talk about. Like there's a really great article in the Society for the History of Technology journal, Technology and Culture, about the history of the term jaywalking and how it was put forth by kind of auto-focused interest. So always keeping around that like our ability to walk freely within the cities has also been very curtailed by historical forces of urban design.
Yeah, there's a really good book called Geography of Nowhere
Mhm.
that really highlights the history of automobile and Jane Jacobs' Death in Life Great Cities talks about that human foot traffic, how important that is for vibrancy of city.
Right.
So I think it's all the things got squashed by this urban interstate.
So, and to your second question about architectural renderings, I am not an architect. If there was an architect in this room, I would invite them to have their opinion on this. But an architect's job is to sell the vision, right? The architect's job is to make someone buy what they're selling. And so right now, if you look at like architectural renderings, they're really lifelike, right? Like, has anyone seen the Harbor Place things? Oh my gosh, they're all sparkly and shining, and like there's people interacting, and you know they always have the right composition of diversity and wheelchair use. Like they are these imagined futures that I think speak to you know, that are meant to be as sort of visually inclusive as possible, but also really sell someone on an image. And I frequently will sit in on crits like at Morgan and within architecture schools. And what I find really tough in those environments, because I'm not the architect, is that the students who have the best design skills going in are the ones who get the most praise for their work, not actually sort of the conceptual thinking of what is this design going to do in a particular space. And so I think there's also a system that rewards those who are really good at telling that graphic story, as opposed to those who might, oh, well, maybe what works best in this space is a school. That's not as flashy as like 6 lanes of pedestrian walkways and big trees and food and beverage, that sort of thing. So I think there's also just a capital element to it as well. Yes.
I guess this wasn't going to be my original question that was related, and I was just kind of wondering, like, if you also need to turn that question on its head and ask, like, was there ever an intention to build that? And I don't know what you would think about that question. But the question I was originally going to ask is actually pretty similar, and that is, so I've been working a little bit with communities on both sides that divide the Harlem Park and Franklin Square since about 2012. Not super heavily, but I've been trying to help them with some of their visions. And I hear a lot from them, what is the city's plan for this space? And I just wonder, like, if I think back to the 1940s to 70s, it's this kind of, the city's keeping these neighborhoods in a holding pattern during that time, and everyone's aware of it. So as you say, RAM is just trying to anticipate and cope with what they know is going to be an inevitable result. What I hear from people in those neighborhoods more recently, and maybe you hear different things, or others here work with them, hear different things. What I hear is like, either the people who are really naive and they're just like, they have no idea what the city's plan is, or there are those who say, yeah, this city is intentionally starving us. They're trying to starve us out and displace us by just leaving us without anything at all. Like, no grocery stores, no, no good schools, no decent housing, not, like when a house is about to fall down, they do very cosmetic work. And I am interested in like your frank assessment as someone who's been studying this, and like, are those impressions that the city is intentionally starving these places? Do you see that as kind of like a parallel to what was going on for those previous 30 years from the 40s to the 70s?
Yeah, I mean, yes, and a lot of things happened in that 1940s to 1970s period, and not all of what happened can be traced back to the city of Baltimore's actions. It was in the small group discussion, I made a point, which was, I don't like sort of like, so for instance, I hear a lot that there are some community members who would like the highway to nowhere term to be stopped, to stop being used, because there's a sense that the to nowhere thing is further devalues that. And I am really, I am sympathetic and empathetic to that. And I think when I talk to community members, it would be, how do you want me to talk about it? The highway to nowhere from a historical, like from my vantage as a historian, is, well, it's a useful analytic, because it doesn't go to another highway. So, but it's a language issue, and I think, as with everything, we need to be sensitive to the language issues where we are talking and speaking. But my biggest pet peeve is when people use the phrase white flight, because there was no white flight. There was systemic disinvestment in Black neighborhoods and the subsidization of suburbanization at the expense of our urban areas. And so, and that just makes it seem unintentional, right? Like, we knew what we were doing. Like, the cities and municipalities knew what was being done when you subsidized infrastructure development. You made the taxes a lot lower, and you kept, Black and brown communities and cities across the US in urban areas, because they weren't offered mortgages or the ability to leave. So I say that to say, yes, the city has not been great about their policy or about their planning initiatives within our West Baltimore and our East Baltimore neighborhoods. But these are contextualized by national trends where we heavily subsidized development that further led to that disinvestment. And unfortunately means that the city is often starved of resources when it comes to investing in places. So I can't put all blame on there. And the other thing I think worth mentioning, there was a lot of philanthropic investment in Sandtown, Winchester during the 1990s under Kurt Schmoke. And one of the sort of findings we see out of some of those initiatives, that people didn't want to stay when they had the opportunity to leave. Neighborhoods change, and it's, in my role at BINA, I know, it's sort of, my job is tracking neighborhood change. But that is always a question in the mind, is that it's not that resources haven't gone in, it's that resources have not gone in to be successful or to promote connectivity or to really redress these long histories of structural procedural racism that resulted in the situation we're in today. So likely not a super satisfying answer, but the historian in my brain is like, well, it's a yes and.
So we are running pretty short of time. There's a really quick question
Yes.
somebody wants to ask from a student, perhaps.
I wanted to know, if you can talk more about how academics teaching about the that is actually allowing communities to fight against these big systematic.
So ask them.
Can you repeat that just to
Sure.
so we get some point?
So the question was, how can we, either as students or as academics, work with communities to make sure that their data needs are being addressed? I think the most simplest answer in the 1 minute I have is ask them. Ask them to define the problems that they want solved. I often think about my job in BINA is to connect I know what my resources are. How can I connect you to what I have or what others in the city might have? Sometimes we need to collect data to understand a problem, but there's so much opportunity to let those questions shape the work that we do. And we shouldn't really be bound, I think, I mean, unfortunately, we are in a certain respect by sort of disciplinary questions, but let's, really sort of dive into what people want defined in their community. And I think that that's a really good starting point for it, and go from there.
Thanks so much. Well, first of all, a round of applause. We're on recording now. Some of us are going to go to lunch. I actually don't know who has said they're interested in going to lunch, so we'll figure that out in a minute. Probably step outside and do that. I'm going to turn off the recording now. Whoops. Stop recording. Okay. Recording's